He yelled at the waitress. Subscribe now or you might miss the revelation that would undo a private empire and change the fate of everyone in that room. The bar smelled of motor oil and lemon cleaner, warm beer and frying bread. The neon sign bleeding red light onto chrome helmets stacked like small moons. The wooden floor sticky with spilled whiskey and old gum. And the clink of glass cut through the chatter like a metal blade. Sarah Monroe, 28, tied her hair back with a rubber band and wore an apron that hid the careful posture of someone who had once spent long nights cataloging data rather than corking bottles. She moved through tables with the practiced calm of a person used to balancing more than plates. The man who rose from a corner table, voice raw with entitlement and whiskey, called her stupid in front of a room full of bikers, executives, and freelancers, and then, seconds later, a half-dozen members of the Hells Angels stood up in unison, and the atmosphere shifted from amusement to attention so quickly it felt like the air itself had been rearranged. What looked like another odd night in a kitschy downtown spot was about to pull a thread that would unravel a pattern of secrecy far outside the bar. Sarah had not told anyone about the last 5 years away from the city where she had grown up. She had a degree from a prestigious university and once worked at a boutique forensic consulting firm where she specialized in metadata analysis and algorithm audits for clients who could afford discretion. She had left after a corporate merger that had promised recognition and delivered silence and threats. Her hands learned to carry trays and not files, but the work never left, the way a scar does not stop reminding you of what broke it. On that night, when the man shouted, she did what she had learned to do in rooms where voices mattered most. She remained measured. She offered an apology she did not mean, and then returned to the bar. But a small notebook fell from the man's jacket, and a corner of a printout showed through. She glanced for a second and saw a name she had not expected to meet outside court transcripts and redacted reports. That glimpse was the inciting tension. Within 48 hours, encrypted emails would resurface, old patents would be contested, and a chain of custody would be questioned in ways that would not let quiet take hold again. The bar was called the Iron Lily, a paradox in itself, with stained glass windows tinted like old photographs, a jukebox that favored 70s rock, the hum of neon, and a bell over the kitchen door that sounded like a small verdict every time it rang. The manager, Leonard Hayes, liked to tell customers that the place was neutral ground. He had a round face and a voice like a cash register. And he had been there long enough to know which fights to let burn out on their own. At the end of the bar stood Marco, the bartender, whose forearms were a map of faded ink, and who kept the espresso machine at just the right hiss. There was Jill, who ran the nights, and kept the reservation book in a leather folder that had survived 3 owners. Tommy and Denise were regulars who debated conspiracy theories at noon and collected war stories at closing. Reverend Peter showed up sometimes on Sundays to drink black coffee and tell secular sermons. Elena Ortiz, a freelance reporter, had an eye for small details and a habit of sitting near the window with a notepad. Those names would matter later, because the social web of a small place multiplies in testimony and memory. The scene was tactile, the heat of the grill, the oil scent when fries hit the fryer, the metallic tang of cheap plates, the rough fabric of leather jackets, a cold draft under the door that smelled of rain. Each sensory fragment anchored a memory someone would call during an investigation. The first real break came when Sarah, cleaning a table, found a USB stick tucked under a napkin holder. It was ordinary, small, and blue, with a sticker that read, "Internal Draft." She balanced it between 2 fingers like a slippery clue and tucked it into her apron. Later that night, after closing, she plugged it into her old laptop in the back office where the light was weak and the smell of dish soap was strong. The files were deliberate and precise. There were spreadsheets with columns of numbers and a document titled Portfolio Risk Algorithm Final.
Metadata hidden in the files said creation by a name she recognized from a dossier that had cost her a career. The metadata also carried a timestamp with a sequence that suggested someone had rewritten the history of authorship. She thought of patents and ownership, of due diligence reports, and of the way reputations are bought with signatures and buried with non-disclosure agreements. She saved a copy, encrypted it, and sent a single message to the one person she thought might listen and act without fear of the consequences. That person was Marcus Reed, 38, a corporate attorney who moved like someone who knew boardroom acoustics the way a pianist knows a keyboard. He had defended whistleblowers and lost some cases and won others, and he had a particular taste for holding large entities accountable. He answered after one ring. "Talk to me," he said in a tone that did not invite jokes. Sarah told him part of what she had found, keeping the names mostly out while testing the waters. Marcus asked 3 precise questions and hung up to do what he did best, which was check the public record against private hints. Within 24 hours, he called back with a list of entities and names that matched.
The algorithm file. One of those names was Victor Hale, CEO of Forge Dynamics, a private consulting firm that had been quietly acquiring stakes in emergent tech companies and had, in the last 5 years, profited handsomely from patents that had been contested or misattributed. Victor was clean in public. He spoke at conferences with a steady cadence, shook hands with committee chairs, and donated to think tanks. He was also the man whose name had shown in the metadata as the beneficiary of rewritten authorship. Marcus outlined a plan. Secure the evidence, find witnesses, build a chain of custody that could survive forensic examination. Sarah felt the old muscle memory return. She was home in the work of looking where others looked away. The scene that introduced the antagonistic force was a private party at a members-only club, where Victor and his associates celebrated a new merger. Sarah, as an anonymous server, moved among trays and champagne, while Victor stood under a low light with his new advisors and a glass that caught the light like a small star. It was in that room that she overheard a half-sentence that connected Victor to a dormant patent and to a name she knew from earlier research that had disappeared from the public record 5 years earlier. The dialogue in that scene is long and precise. "Is the signature cleared?" asked a man with a beaded bracelet and the voice of investor meetings. "Cleared and boxed," replied a woman with lacquered nails. "Good," said Victor. "We close, and the rest is noise." Sarah served hors d'oeuvres, and a hand knocked against a waiter tray, a spill, an apology, and then a line that tasted like poison. "You should be grateful you get to serve our money." The man who had yelled at her at the Iron Lily was one of Victor's people. The room smelled of perfume and old money, of polished wood and cigars. Sarah left with the fragment of conversation lodged in her memory like a splinter. Investigative work unfolded in stealthy sequences. Marcus subpoenaed emails and pulled corporate filings, while Sarah reconstructed the timeline of patent submissions and shifted authorship. They found inconsistencies in metadata across versions, signatures that carried timestamps manipulated by proxy servers, and an algorithm repository with commit logs that had been carefully overwritten. The technical descriptions were precise and accessible. A digital forensics audit showed that metadata entries had been altered by a process known as timestamp forging, which involves intercepting a file's record and rewriting it to display a later creation date. It required access to internal servers and a knowledge of the repository's commit history. The audit also revealed a chain of proxies that led back to an offshore VPS registered under an entity tied to a shell company used by Forge Dynamics to obfuscate authorship. These procedural details were explained to a lay audience with care, so that the path from a file on a stick to the control of an entire portfolio could be followed. The criminal cover-up was not elegant. It relied on the inertia of corporate processes and the willingness of intermediaries to accept the comfort of forged paper. Sarah's backstory was a compact and ache-filled history that clarified why this fight mattered.
She had grown up in a small town where access to internet libraries was a lifeline and where curiosity was a luxury. Her mother worked nights at a plant and learned overtime as a strategy to pay for a community college course. Sarah had been the first in her family to attend a selective university, where she studied applied mathematics and computer science and discovered forensic analysis almost by accident in a lab where she volunteered to help reconcile data sets that students had thrown away as unsolvable. She had bright scholarships and mentors who taught her the language of metadata and of code provenance. A mistake in one project led to her exposing a research assistant who tried to claim credit for a collaborative paper. That exposure burned her early reputation in the academic community and made her cautious about recognition. She then worked at a boutique firm where she audited algorithms for financial clients and helped attribute authorship for machine learning models used in trading. She loved the work for its clarity and for the quiet justice of writing misattribution. The merger that came later promised a platform and an office with a view, but delivered a non-disclosure and a subtle pressure to let some things go. When she refused to accept a clause that would force her to relinquish authorship for a project she had helped build, she was pushed out in a way that looked like a resignation. The personal cost included her professional file being scrubbed and a silence that suggested a lesson. Talent could be pushed into the margins and then erased. She left to make a life that allowed her to keep her dignity, but also to avoid the full brutality of people who wielded institutional power. This provided motive in the sense that she was not only protecting an old work, but also reclaiming identity. Characters multiplied as the investigation unfolded. Marcus Reed coordinated legal strategy and reached out to Allison Chen, a litigator with a knack for complex patent disputes. Elena Ortiz, the reporter, began digging into ownership structures and found a pattern of shell entities. Cole Ramirez, the biker who led the local Hells Angels charter, provided street-level intelligence and a surprising willingness to protect witnesses in public spaces. David Price, Victor's right hand, tried to smooth relationships with local vendors. Leonard Hayes held a quiet memory of the man who had spat words at Sarah and later refused to recant. Jill kept the reservation book, which became an odd piece of evidence when timestamps on reservation notes matched movements of key players. Reverend Peter offered character testimony about Sarah's steadiness and community work.
Each name had small actions associated with them that later would be helpful when giving statements. The social map made it harder for Victor's team to claim that no one had seen what had happened. Tension built through a series of moments or nodes where the stakes escalated. The first major moment came when a confidential email that appeared to be an internal memo from Forge Dynamics leaked to Elena and then to the public. The memo referenced prioritized portfolios and included a screenshot blotted with redactions that had been poorly applied. Marcus and Allison converged on this as evidence of conscious concealment. For 5 minutes in a cafe converted into an ad hoc war room, the conversation was electric and long. "If we can prove deliberate obfuscation," said Allison, "we have grounds for tortious interference and fraud." "We have metadata that shows timestamp tampering," Marcus replied. "We need witnesses who can place the file's movement through the chain." Sarah added a quiet detail about a server log that only internal users had access to. The exchanges were dense and tested the patience and grit of each person involved. The alliance with the Hells Angels was unexpected and complicated. Cole Ramirez had a reputation in the community as someone who protected people who were pushed around and who valued respect above law. He had not been quiet about his contempt for corporations that exploited the working class for patents and then erased credit for ideas. The moment he stood at the Iron Lily and watched a man insult the woman who had never asked for his attention, something in his posture shifted. He and his cohort rose not as a threat to the room, but as a statement that the social code had been violated. Cole met Sarah after that night.
"You do not answer to them," he said simply. "We do not like bullies." His network offered protection for witnesses in ways legal teams could not. At first, Marcus bristled at the idea of collaborating with people the press often painted as violent. Later, he acknowledged that their involvement would keep certain threats at bay and would discourage peaceful coercion. The alliance worked in a tactical way. Bikers attended depositions when safety was a concern, and their presence created a buffer that Victor's intimidation tactics did not easily penetrate. This introduced messy moral choices into the narrative and forced Sarah and Marcus to consider how justice sometimes depends on unlikely partners. The plan that emerged was careful and sequential. It required locking down copies of the original files, tracking financial flows that linked Forge Dynamics to its shell companies, and finding a living author who could attest to original work. They needed to perform due diligence that would stand up in court and press. Part of the plan was technical and part of it was human. Technically, they needed to run an engineering reverse audit of code commits and repository histories while isolating server logs and
obtaining service provider metadata that would show origin IPs. These procedural descriptions were explained in plain language. An engineering reverse audit meant reconstructing the sequence of code changes, preserving hash values where possible, and creating a timeline of commits. They obtained subpoenas for the version control system and for backups stored in cold archives, which revealed a series of manual overwrites. They documented that the overwrites had been performed using an administrative token issued to a consultant with ties to Victor. Financial analysis traced the consultant's payments to a small group of shell companies tied to Forge Dynamics. Each procedural move had a chain of custody step attached and an audit trail to ensure admissibility. Humanly, they needed testimonies. They found Dr. Annika Bose, an academic who had collaborated on the original model and who had disappeared from the public record after a paid settlement 5 years earlier. Marcus flew to meet her in a university town where she taught guest classes. Her backstory filled a crucial gap. She had been promised co-authorship and a lab position that never materialized. She had settled quietly for fear of legal battles and wage anxiety. When shown the new findings, she agreed to testify that the core architecture of the algorithm matched her lab's notes and that she had not been credited. Her statement gave the case a human face beyond the cold language of metadata. The confrontation scene was public and staged. They arranged for a hearing at a small claims venue that had media access and where character testimony could be garnered. Victor's team arrived with counsel and a public relations plan. The room was stark with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly raw. There were documents on the table that smelt faintly of toner and coffee. The dialogue in that confrontation was long and formal, with back and forths designed to unsettle. "Mr. Hale," said Allison as she began, "we have put forth evidence of deliberate misattribution and of coordinated activity to obscure authorship." Victor leaned forward. "We have acquired these assets through legitimate acquisition and have complied with all regulatory filings." Marcus stood and presented a timeline of commits with corresponding metadata and payment trails. Dr. Bose took the stand and described her involvement and the timeline of submissions. Sarah was called to describe how she found the USB and how she handled the files. The exchange between counsel was tight and included repeated challenges about chain of custody. Victor's counsel attempted to deny the administrative access that allowed overwrites, but Marcus produced the subpoenaed logs. The room shuddered with a mix of legal jargon and bare human truth as the assembled witnesses and lawyers debated causality and intent. The climax came when Elena produced a photograph taken at the members-only party showing Victor gesturing toward a document while one of his associates spoke about signature clearing. The image was time-stamped and matched server logs. The combination of human testimony, metadata, and financial testimony. Tracing created a cognitive dissonance for the audience and for some members of Victor's advisory board who had not fully understood the breadth of activity conducted by the CEO. The aftermath was rapid. The board of Forge Dynamics moved to freeze certain transactions and appointed an independent review. Victor's public image fractured, and stock-like measures of public trust shifted as journalists and analysts picked through the story. David Price resigned. Several senior advisors attempted damage control by publicly distancing themselves. There were legal motions seeking injunctions and countersuits, and a press release that read like damage control dressed as dignity. Authorities opened an inquiry, and a prosecutor requested forensic copies of servers. Some suppliers issued statements about how they had been consulted and backed out of certain projects. The Hells Angels' presence at depositions made threats of intimidation less likely in the local context, and the community that had watched the Iron Lily become a small hub of resistance rallied. Donations came in for legal defense, and an online petition gained thousands of signatures demanding accountability. There were costs. Sarah received threatening messages. Someone tried to break into her car. Leonard Hayes found his business receiving anonymous calls. Marcus received menacing emails that suggested he should stop. But the public reaction also brought protections and a level of scrutiny that made further quiet suppression costly for Victor's team. A series of legal procedures followed, and their technical descriptions were explained with clarity to viewers. The legal team filed a motion for a temporary restraining order against Forge Dynamics to prevent destruction of evidence. The court required preservation of hardware and the appointment of a neutral forensic auditor. The forensic auditor ran checksum comparisons and validated that the files in their original repositories had been altered. They used hash-based verification to show discrepancies. These are small technical details that are easy to misunderstand, so they were presented simply. Hash-based verification is a process of applying an algorithm to a file to create a unique digital fingerprint, and if a file changes, even slightly, its fingerprint changes. The auditor showed that original fingerprints recorded in backups did not match the current files on Forge Dynamics servers, indicating overriding. Additionally, network logs traced administrative tokens to an IP address tied to a consultant. The combination of digital and financial evidence strengthened the legal case to the point where a grand jury inquiry seemed plausible. Victor's defense tried to recast the story as an internal miscommunication and a dispute over interpretation of collaborative work. He painted Dr. Bose as litigious and suggested that her statements came from personal grudges. The media debate at times blurred into personality coverage and clickbait. But the more substantive pieces of evidence continued to surface. The oversight board at a leading journal re-examined the authorship of the original paper and issued a statement that would later become an important formal recognition of misattribution. That public rectification mattered as much symbolically
as legally. People who had been boxed into silence began to come forward with small corroborating details about contract clauses and edits. The pattern of small actions coalesced into a structural picture of how a company could reassign credit with plausible cover. The fall of Forge Dynamics was not apocalyptic. Victor was placed under investigation and later faced civil litigation. There were settlements in some cases and criminal inquiries in others. The company had to revise its published credits and transfer certain patents to their rightful contributors or provide licensing terms that recognized original contributors. Some executives lost positions. The market reaction was messy, and for a while many employees suffered collateral damage. Nonetheless, the narrative outcome was clear. Accountability had been enforced in public ways, and the practice of erasing authorship was no longer comfortably unseen in that sector. The community that rallied around Sarah felt vindicated. The way reputations were restored was imperfect but meaningful. Restitution came in different forms. Some formerly credited individuals received back pay and amended records. Others recovered what little they could and moved on to new ventures. The Hells Angels did not become civic heroes in a classical sense, but their role in challenging localized bullying and in helping to protect witnesses complicated standard narratives about law and order. The epilogue followed 3 time markers that rounded the story into human terms. 1 month later, Sarah was still recovering from the shock. She had become an unexpected name in local news, and offers of interviews arrived with the kind of polite insistence reserved for those who have been through something that sells copy. Her hands had returned to serving, but she now carried a small card with the contact details of a legal advisor and a new laptop with encrypted backups. She slept more fitfully and kept her phone off when possible. She met for coffee with Elena, who wanted to write a longer piece that centered less on the sensational aspects and more on the structures that had allowed Erasure to succeed. Marcus negotiated paused demands for anonymity from new witnesses, and Allison worked on formalizing the litigation strategy while coordinating with prosecutors. The bar had a new plaque that read, in small pipe, "Community Safe Space," because business had changed and the Iron Lily had a role that it never asked for and did not try to monetize. 3 months later, the legal processes had advanced. The independent forensic audit had been received by the court, and a civil suit moved forward with depositions. Dr. Bose had a corrected record published in a respected journal and a modest grant to restart a lab. Sarah had been offered a fellowship to consult on metadata attribution at a nonprofit, but she hesitated because the idea of returning to the world she had left felt complicated and emotionally expensive. She accepted a part-time advisory role and began teaching a night class at the community college on data ethics and code provenance. The community
Reaction had matured into something like appreciation. Cole Ramirez and his chapter received public statements asking to meet with civic leaders to talk about community safety and witness protection after an awkward set of op-eds that debated legitimacy and legality. 6 months later, the case reached a settlement that included formal recognition of misattribution in several patents and a structured compensation plan for a group of affected contributors. Victor had stepped down and faced ongoing inquiries. Forge Dynamics had to revise its acquisition protocols and to submit to an audit committee for 2 years. Sarah had chosen to continue both serving tables and teaching with a lighter schedule and a firmer voice. She and Marcus had cultivated a mutual respect that had hints of something softer but not yet named. They had meetings in quiet coffee shops and shared encoded jokes about server logs and bad coffee. The bar had become a place where Sarah could be both the person who waits on tables and the person who had been willing to reclaim a stolen history. She did not need spectacle to be recognized, and in private moments she allowed herself to feel restored. The final reflection was honest and unromantic about cost and gain. Nothing erased the nights when she worried about retribution or the loneliness of being the person who forced expensive institutions to change. But in exchange, she gained a small set of corrected records, a community that stood up when it mattered, and a reclaimed sense of professional integrity. There was no tidy victory over systemic issues, but a clear example that coordinated evidence collection, unlikely alliances, and public pressure could make a difference. If you saw in this story a reminder that quiet people can carry dangerous knowledge and that courage looks different depending on the context, spread the word and subscribe if you want more investigations into how the unseen scaffolding of power can be exposed by people who refuse to let their work be stolen. And remember the image of a woman who went back to her station after being shouted at and whose life then led to a courtroom where metadata and testimony forced accountability. She did not always feel like a hero. She did not always want the attention. She did not run. She decided to stand.